I'm a psychotherapist in private practice, and I work primarily with women, doing individual work with women, sharing their journeys and exploring their dreams and imagery that emerges from the unconscious, and working with spiritual material that comes up out of their own life journeys. And I also do collective work, working a great deal, again, with women, and working a great deal around the imagery of the darkness. The first retreat I offered 10 years ago was called Journey to the Dark Feminine, and I offered that retreat after I returned from Europe, visiting the Black Madonnas. And we explore the imagery of the Dark Virgin and the imagery of the darkness in terms of the old stories and in terms of our own life stories. And we make masks and work with them in terms of the personal cast of characters, and also using the masks as a bridge to the sacred experience. I'm primarily interested in the darkness in its radiant aspect, and as it being that unknown, undefined source that all creative form emerges from. And that in the stories repeatedly, the transformation, the healing experience, the moment of awareness occurs in the depths and in the darkness, and that darkness becomes the chaotic source that creative spirit, from which creative spirit bursts forth. My husband and I and my son, when he was 5 years old, lived on Crete for 6 months, and it was a really special time in my life. We traded days, so I would stay home one day and my husband would be out on the island, and then he would stay home with our son and I'd be out on the island alone. And so that meant that 3 days a week, and then we had one family day, and 3 days a week I was totally alone to myself, and I created this special place for myself down by the sea, and I'd read and do journal work and just be with myself and play. And after we'd been living there about 5 months, I had this dream, and it is the clearest, most powerful dream I've ever had in my life still. That was 15 years ago. And the first part of the dream basically was an overview of my life until that point in time. And then the final phase of the dream, I was in a country in southern France, and I had painted a painting, and we were there for the unveiling of that painting. And the painting was being displayed in a large building which was called the International Hotel. And I was taken up we came into the entrance into the hotel, and I was taken up the stairs by a young woman who I'd worked with in therapy for many years before that time. And she took me up into this room, up 2 stories, up this winding staircase. And in the middle of the room was the painting. And I stepped to the middle of the room to look at the painting, and the painting was painted on silk instead of canvas. And when the sun came through the room, it shone onto the canvas, and the whole room was filled with rainbow colors. And the painting initially was a painting of the Pieta, and it was a picture of, or an image of the Virgin Mary and with the body of Christ, and she was totally supporting the body of Christ, and there was a figure off in the shadows. And the 3 of them formed like a triangle, and behind them was an old wooden cross. And all of a sudden the painting rose up by itself, and as the painting rose up, the image totally shifted, and the figure moved out from the shadows, and it was another woman. And she was very dark, and she stood at the foot of the cross. and the cross rose up, and the figure of Christ rose up, and his arms were raised like this, and he was in the figure or an image of joy, and the two women stood at the base of his feet, and one was the Virgin Mary, and then I just heard in the dream the phrase, the other Mary, repeated over and over and over again. And that dream was extremely moving to me. I woke up and went and wrote it down, and then throughout the rest of the time on the island, spent a great deal of time just reflecting about that dream. And what that dream said to me was that, well, initially in that first image, first I need to say, that's the only dream I'd ever had to that point, and since that time, in Christian symbology. I just don't dream of Christian images. And the initial image said to me that the feminine principle in the form of the Virgin Mary, the Light Mary, was totally supporting the sacred image. But in that initial image, the sacred image was dead, was no longer filled with vital or life energy. And then as the image shifts, the other Mary, the dark Mary, comes out of the shadows, and that allows the sacred energy to rise up in joy. And then there's a great celebration. That was the feeling of that image, a real celebration of the sacred imagery, or of the sacred energy. And that energy is emanating from the feminine as source in both its forms, in the light and the dark form. And from that point on, I began to pursue and follow the other Mary, because that didn't mean anything to me at that point. I was raised in a rather fundamentalist religious tradition, not the Catholic tradition, and Mary really had very little meaning for me. From that point on, I began to pursue Mary, particularly in that darker form and as the other Mary. And I was drawn to Mary Magdalene and to the Gnostic teachings, and learned that Mary Magdalene was often referred to as the woman who knew the all, and was seen in the Gnostic tradition as the 13th disciple, and was seen as the closest to Christ, or the closest to the sacred energy, and was seen as the one who had greatest access to the mystery. When we returned, shortly after coming back to the States, Begg's book came out, and I then began to also pursue the tradition of the other Mary. And he talks about there being actually two traditions, and the lighter Mary, of course, being carried through the Catholic Church, and the darker Mary sinking underground and moving into to that more unknown place in the culture, and of course representing that deeper, more unknown aspect. In terms of my own experience, the next major step for me was about 5 years after that dream. We have over the years done a lot of work with Edith Sewell, and she suggested that she and eight of us, make a pilgrimage to visit Black Madonnas in Europe. And at once when she mentioned that, I remembered that dream and knew that the Black Madonna was another expression of the other Mary. And we visited the Black Madonna at Einsiedel and also Rocamadour, France. And they were both very moving for me, but particularly the Black Madonna at Rocamadour. And she's in a little chapel that really looks just like a cave. And it's like she's sequestered away in that darker, more internal place of incubation, is what it's like for me. Caves have always, for me, carried that energy of being able to move into the silence and deep into oneself, where things can cook and boil and bubble, and I can be closer to a deeper level of myself. I also was very drawn to the darkness even before the dream of the other Mary, because there was a time in my life when I felt that that spiritual experiences were for other people. I was involved very much in a tradition where the emphasis was on the light and was on transcendence and rising above, and none of that kind of imagery spoke to me. And so I thought that spiritual experiences were for other people. And then I was fortunate enough to come together with a group of women who were associated with the Association of Transpersonal Psychology when that organization was just forming. And we gathered together in San Francisco, and I heard women talking about darkness and about dropping down and about the earth. And those images, those metaphors really spoke to me. And suddenly I began to know that that the spiritual world was also available to me. And I think that's very important because I think women are often drawn to different metaphors and different images. And they need to know that those metaphors, those images can also lead them home to God. And I think our definition of God has been far too small, too narrow, and I think that as many of us are being called back to the darkness and to the dark virgins, that we have the opportunity to explore a new vision of God, an image of God, a vision of God that is much bigger, and that includes the darkness, that includes the earth, that includes sensuality and sexuality, and that shows us that the sacred experience is much bigger than we ever realized. And I'm particularly interested in the darkness in terms of its radiant aspect. I think we've learned a lot about the darkness in terms of depression, in terms of, and somewhat we've been exploring recently in terms of the Kali image, and in terms of women knowing that that they can find a way to express their anger. But I'm more interested in the darkness in terms of radiance, and in the stories of women. Repeatedly they're called down and they're called into the darkness, and that dark, deep space, often under the earth, as you mentioned, in the deep river, in the well, in the cave, that's where the transformation occurs. That's where the miracle happens. And that aspect of the darkness for me speaks to that unknown source, that unmanifest, unnamed, unrevealed experience of the sacred energy, expression of the sacred energy from which all creative form emerges. It's that unnamed, unnamed, unmanifest, unrevealed source that all creative form emerges from. And I'm very interested in exploring that in my own life and with other women, because it seems that the darkness is calling to many of us now, and it's like it's calling us home to our souls. For me, the dark forms of the Virgin carry a much deeper connection to earth, to sensuality, to animals, to the instinctual, and a much greater sense of compassion. And they carry us much farther back in time than the light virgins, to the connection with Isis and to the connection with the Mother Goddess.
How are they linked?
Well, my understanding historically is, I draw a lot from Beg and from the work that was done. I'm sorry, I don't remember the author who did the work around the Black Madonna at Einsiedel.
Fred Gustafson.
Right, Gustafson. And also China Galan's work of connecting the Black Madonnas to Tara and also to the roots of Isis and back in through Egypt and Africa. That's what seems to carry the most energy for me. The Magdalene was the first person to see the risen Christ in the Christian tradition, and I don't think that's an accident. I think that's because she really understood that when the sacred energy rises up in its fullness, that includes the body, and the body is then welcomed in to the sacred experience, and that the body and sexuality and sensuality and the feelings can all also bring us home to God and can connect us with the sacred experience. And I think the Magdalene is the clearest example of that in her understanding that the body is also to be revered and to be celebrated. To answer your question about the other Mary, and as to whether the Black Madonna is an expression of the other Mary, she is for me. And she's an expression of, since Mary really in the Christian tradition is the only expression we have of the sacred feminine. And through the centuries, she became lighter and lighter and more perfect. And I think as that happened, she was no longer accessible to women as a way to tap into the sacred experience. And I think that the Dark Madonna or the other Mary is a way to again tap into the sacred material and into the sacred experience through an image in our own Christian tradition. And I know again for myself that there was a real emptiness, a real sadness in me, that there was no feminine imagery in my own tradition in the West. The only thing that I found that came even close to it, again, was the Virgin Mary, and she didn't carry power for me, or that wonderful phrase, the Mother of God. And that phrase, when I took it away from the Light Virgin Mary, that's a wonderful phrase, the Mother of God. So that is another place in our own tradition where the feminine as sacred is acknowledged. And the Black Madonna, I think, is a way to reconnect with the sacred in feminine form for modern women. And I think that in our own tradition, it is probably the only image that continues to carry numinous power. You just talked about virginity as a woman unto herself. And when I was with the Black Madonna at Rocamadour, that's what really stood out for me about that particular dark virgin. She is so clearly a woman who has a deep sense of herself and carries real strength and grounded power in and of her own being, and it's a very basic, primitive type power. And I was really moved because the Son in that, the Christ child in that particular Black Virgin, she doesn't even hardly touch it. They're practically, her hand is just almost to the side of it, and it's like the divine child is really free to be lived out in whatever form each of us takes. And the Virgin as not as chaste, but as a woman unto herself, is really clearly seen for me in that particular Dark Madonna. And also in that sense of a virgin forest from which anything can blossom or bloom. And there's nothing about that image that speaks to buttons and bows and, and again, the kind of classic images of what it means to be feminine. You talk about the light virgin in some ways being a repressive image for women, and the darker form really speaking to liberation and greater freedom. And what that triggers in me is the concept of Jung about perfection and completion, and he saw perfection and completion on a continuum, with perfection at one end and completion at the other end. And for me, the lighter version of the Madonna has moved much too far towards the end of perfection, just as the culture in its patriarchal form has really emphasized perfection. And as we've moved in that direction, once again, I think then the virgin or the sacred feminine fails to carry power for women because it becomes too pure, too perfect, and beyond reach. And the darker form is much more towards the other end of that continuum, the end of, or the aspect of completion, which by definition includes the imperfect and embraces all aspects of what it means to be a woman. And in that sense is extremely liberating and extremely freeing. And I think as a culture we have to begin to move towards a place of balance where what individuation means and individuality means or is defined in terms of living out one's totality and experiencing completion and imperfection as an aspect of wholeness and thus an aspect of the sacred. I do quite a bit of work with masks and am interested in the image of the dark sacred as it's seen around the world. And I've been very interested in the image of Kali, and this is Rangda out of Bali, which is the Balinese version of the Kali energy, of the Durga energy. And I'm very interested in this face of the dark sacred because it's an image that we don't know very well in Western culture. And I think it's a very powerful image because it speaks to the importance and the ability to bite through and to know when something's finished and when it's completed. Both Rangda and Kali are often shown wearing necklaces of skulls, and I think that's because, again, they know when something's finished, and they teach us how to push out the old form so that the new energy and the new creative form can come in. And in Bali, they know that this particular image, this particular form, is very important in terms of expressing the destructive power of the sacred feminine, but that it is also intrinsically connected to the creative form. I also think it's an important image for women because we haven't learned very much about expressing our strength or expressing our anger. And I think this image provides a way for us to do that with clarity and with finality. Again, because the image of the Black Madonna is, for me, is more primitive and more basic. It carries us back to that mother goddess teaching that death and life are intrinsically connected, and that it's that circular are that cyclical motion of death and rebirth. And in that ancient tradition and in the image of the Dark Madonna, life and death are not nearly so split off. And we're repeatedly reminded that death is a finishing of one phase and an ushering in of that new birth and that new creative spirit. I think the Black Madonna is intrinsically connected with the unconscious in her, because of her darkness. The unconscious has archetypally been seen as that dark, unknown, undefined space within us. And so the darkness automatically invites us to drop down into that unconscious, creative, chaotic space within us. Dreams, of course, flow out of that unconscious void and act like messengers to the conscious world, serve as a bridge between the two worlds, connecting the known and the unknown, and the seen and the unseen, and the manifest and the unmanifest. Traditionally, the Dark Madonnas were seen as working the greatest miracles, the Dark Madonnas particularly in Europe. They were the pilgrimage sites that were seen as the most sacred and the most powerful in terms of bringing about healing experiences. And the Black Madonnas were, it's my understanding, were primarily preserved because of the peasants and because of the common people knowing about their miracle working powers. I think there's some place deep within us that the darkness calls to us, and it stirs something very old that we're remembering. And I think what we're remembering is that we have souls. And I think the darkness is very much connected with soul, and that we are being called home to our souls, and we're doing everything we can to reconnect with that deeper aspect of our being. There's some wonderful lines from Rilke that really speak to the power of the darkness. No matter how deeply I go down into myself, my God is dark, and like a webbing made of 100 roots that drink in silence. I think it's that darkness that we're all seeking. I think the mother aspect of God brings in a warmth and a compassion and extends the possibility of connection to that sacred energy in a way that father imagery doesn't allow. And I'm deeply sympathetic to what China Galan says in her book, Longing for Darkness, about consciously using the word God rather than goddess, because in our language, I think that word has tended to carry more power. And I love her phraseology, our inclusion of the phrase, the mother God. I think her primary message is that we, at this point in time, have the opportunity to explore a new vision of God, a larger, more encompassing vision of God, a God that includes mother, the mother God, a God that includes the feminine, and a God that includes the darkness. And I think that the Dark Virgin teaches us that the mystery is much greater than we even imagined, and paradoxically that we as individuals are greater than we imagined, and that we are whole and beautiful just as we are now.